Beneath the polished floors of royal palaces lies something the public was never meant to see. A vault not listed in official records. A chamber sealed not just by locks, but by silence. For generations, only the reigning Queen Consort knew what was kept there. But everything changed the moment Camilla stepped across that invisible line. For centuries, the monarchy's true power was never fully displayed in public ceremonies or glittering state banquets. It was hidden, locked away beneath layers of tradition, protocol, and fear. Deep below Buckingham Palace, beyond the official crown jewels that tourists whisper about, there has long been talk of a second vault. Not ceremonial, not catalogued. A private chamber said to hold pieces too controversial, too emotionally charged, or too politically dangerous to ever see daylight. Jewels that were never meant to sparkle for applause, but to exist as silent symbols of authority, obedience, and control. This vault was governed not by law, but by inheritance customs older than the palace walls themselves. Queen Mary, the architect of modern royal order, enforced rules so strict they were never written down. Access was not a right. It was a test. Only women who proved absolute loyalty to the crown, not love, not popularity, not public sympathy, were permitted near its contents. These jewels were not ornaments. They were rewards and warnings. Each stone carried the weight of abdications, broken marriages, political betrayals, and silenced rebellions. Those who came before Camilla understood this unspoken danger. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, treated the vault with reverence and restraint, never touching pieces that might reopen old wounds. Diana, despite her global fame and emotional pull, was quietly guided away from certain heirlooms. She sensed what they represented. She obeyed, even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. Because wearing the wrong jewel was never just a fashion mistake. It was a declaration of power, and sometimes of defiance. Whispers of forbidden tiaras circulated for decades. Crowns rumored to have been worn during moments of national crisis. Pieces associated with women who challenged the monarchy and paid for it with exile or erasure. Jewels that vanished from public record after a single appearance. Locked away not because they were damaged, but because they were too loaded with meaning, too dangerous to repeat. Then Camilla arrived, not as a fairy tale consort, not as a beloved symbol, but as a woman who had waited decades in the shadows, absorbing every slight, every rule, every silent judgment. When she entered the vault for the first time, palace insiders expected caution, familiarity, respect. Instead, what followed unsettled even the most seasoned courtiers. Camilla didn't hesitate. She asked questions no one had asked before. She touched pieces that were never meant to be handled again. And most shocking of all, she treated the vault not as a shrine, but as a statement waiting to be rewritten. What she did inside that chamber didn't echo through the palace halls immediately. It didn't need to. Because in royal circles, silence is often louder than outrage. And from that moment on, those who understood the old rules knew something irreversible had begun. The vault had been crossed, the silence broken. But to understand how Queen Camilla defied tradition, we must first uncover the invisible rulebook every royal woman was expected to follow. Jewels in the royal family aren't just accessories. They're coded messages, diplomatic weapons, and proof of place in the bloodline. But few know the strict silent code that governed who could wear what. And Camilla? She wasn't supposed to pass even the first line. Within the monarchy, every gem tells a story. But more than that, every jewel speaks a language. Diamonds are not just for dazzle. They are declarations. Sapphires whisper of mourning or reconciliation. Emeralds hint at fertility, fertility of lineage or diplomacy. And rubies burn with royal assertion, meant for only the most powerful of matriarchs. These weren't simple choices of ornamentation. They were hierarchies carved in stone. A private code, never written down, but brutally enforced. At the top of this hidden order were the state jewels, untouchable without direct permission from the reigning monarch. Beneath them, the ceremonial pieces, worn only on select occasions by those in impeccable standing. Then, the personal heirlooms, passed hand to hand, blood to blood, guarded by both sentiment and strategy. Every woman who entered the royal sphere was measured by this code. Wallis Simpson, for all her defiance, never cracked it. Stripped of titles, forbidden from the vaults, she was left to wear borrowed glimmers and whispers of what could have been. Princess Margaret, despite her birthright, often found herself boxed out, not by birth, but by behavior. The crown watches, waits, and withholds. Diana, even in her meteoric rise to global icon, found herself locked out of key pieces. Her beauty and charisma could win over the world, but they could not unlock the jewels the palace had quietly placed off-limits. Her tiaras were stunning, but carefully curated. Certain necklaces? Never offered. Certain brooches? Moved out of sight before she ever stepped into the room. Even in her highest moments, she sensed it, the quiet curation of her place. Queen Elizabeth II never explained these rules. She never needed to. She enforced them not with confrontation, but with absence. A jewel denied was a message received. She kept her power not just in her silence, but in how she chose to distribute or restrict the symbols of that power. No fanfare, no reasoning, just a vault that either opened or it didn't. So when Camilla emerged, long after decades of being branded the other woman, few believed she would be allowed near those codes. She was not born royal. She was not accepted by the public. And for years she remained on the margins, wrapped in pearls but nowhere near the sapphires or emeralds that once adorned Diana's neck. The assumption within the royal circle was simple. Camilla would never ascend past ornamental irrelevance. She might carry the title, but the jewels would remain silent. Until they didn't. Her first official appearance as Queen Consort, following the Queen's death, shattered that assumption. Around her neck sat a necklace known within the palace as the Queen's Circle, a piece rarely worn in public, and never granted to anyone outside direct succession. It was said to represent continuity, unity of the crown, a symbol once reserved for Elizabeth and her mother before her. And now it shimmered on Camilla's chest, as if daring the world to argue with it. The shock was immediate but controlled. No statements, no corrections. Just a knowing silence from Buckingham's corridors, and quiet glances among those who understood what had been breached. Camilla hadn't just worn a necklace. She'd broken through the first wall, and what lay behind it would test every remaining rule the monarchy still pretended to protect. But wearing a single forbidden necklace was only the beginning. Camilla was about to break a rule even Queen Elizabeth never dared to challenge. There was one tiara so politically loaded, so emotionally fraught, that it hadn't been worn in over 6 decades. Even Diana was quietly warned never to touch it. So why, on a seemingly ordinary state visit, did Queen Camilla emerge wearing it in full daylight? The Russian sapphire tiara wasn't just forgotten. It was buried. A piece with a history soaked in secrets, said to have been gifted under dubious terms during a fragile détente between the British Crown and a collapsing empire. It was linked, according to long-whispered accounts, to an assassination. a betrayal, a marriage that broke under the weight of politics. Every time it surfaced in conversation, it came with a warning. Too dangerous, too symbolic, too much. Queen Elizabeth II, for all her power and precision, never acknowledged its existence in public. Not once was she photographed wearing it. Not once did it appear in official inventories. But within the royal circles, its legend never faded. It was a relic not of celebration, but of crisis, and yet it remained polished, preserved, waiting. Camilla's decision to wear it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of oversight or even bold fashion. It was strategy, one that blindsided even the most seasoned royal observers. The event was diplomatic, formal, but unremarkable on the surface. A reception with representatives from Eastern European nations, many of whom had turbulent histories with both Britain and Russia. It was the sort of gathering where subtle signals mattered more than the speeches. And there she stood, Queen Camilla, radiant and immovable, the Russian sapphire crowning her head like a challenge. The room froze. What had been intended as a ceremonial event suddenly became an earthquake. The sapphire wasn't merely rare, it was radioactive. Its very presence opened a wound that had been deliberately sealed for decades. Courtiers were caught off guard. No pre-approved list had included the piece. The press scrambled for explanations. The palace gave none. But the insiders understood immediately. Camilla had crossed a forbidden threshold. Not only had she revived a tiara never meant to be worn again, she had chosen that moment, that audience, and that political climate to do it. The reaction from within the family was colder than stone. Prince William, who had long been positioned as the steady bridge between past and future, saw it as a provocation. That tiara, long considered a ghost relic of a darker royal chapter, had been discussed in private by his late mother. Diana had once inquired about it, only to be told it was off-limits. Too controversial, too cursed. That memory, to him, wasn't distant. It was raw. And now Camilla wore it as if it had never been buried at all. To the public, it was another glittering moment. But to those behind palace walls, it was a message. Camilla wasn't merely stepping into the role of Queen Consort. She was rewriting what the role meant. Rewriting the visual language of power. If Elizabeth had used restraint to preserve the monarchy's mystery, Camilla was now using visibility to bend its future. Every jewel, every choice, every appearance was no longer ceremonial. It was deliberate, disruptive, and undeniably personal. But this wasn't just about tiaras. Camilla's next move would shake the monarchy's entire foundation of inheritance. Royal inheritance isn't just about titles, it's about objects that define legitimacy. For centuries, jewels passed down in quiet, expected lines. But behind closed doors, Camilla redirected the flow, and some believe it wasn't just her right, it was her revenge. In the royal world, power doesn't always shift with crowns. It moves through necklaces, tiaras, and brooches that carry far more than diamonds. They carry memory, identity, position. These are not mere accessories. They are declarations of status, authority, and lineage. And there has always been an unspoken path for these treasures to travel, from Queen to Princess of Wales, in a line that reinforces the monarchy's delicate structure. After Queen Elizabeth, that path was clear. Camilla might wear the jewels, but they were expected to pass to Catherine. That expectation was quiet, but firm. Diana's jewels, in particular, were seen as symbolic promises. Promises that one day Catherine would complete what her mother-in-law never could. That she would wear them not as a ghost of the past, but as a bridge to the future. But that bridge began to crumble the moment Camilla stepped into the vault, and claimed pieces for herself, permanently. It started subtly. Certain tiaras long associated with Diana were never seen again. Others were quietly assigned to different family members, bypassing Catherine entirely. Royal watchers noticed, but the palace remained silent. And in that silence, rumors grew louder. That Camilla wasn't just borrowing, that she was reassigning, that the jewels were being rerouted not by tradition, but by her own hand. The emotional cost behind the scenes was devastating. Insiders spoke of moments where Catherine was visibly shaken. One report described her leaving a private event in tears after learning that a specific heirloom, allegedly promised to her by the late Queen, had instead been given elsewhere, permanently. Not lost, not stolen, just reassigned. No explanation, no apology, just a new set of rules written in silence. There were no official statements, of course. The monarchy thrives on discretion. But within the royal family, jewel placement speaks louder than protocol. And as Camilla continued to appear in public wearing pieces once tied to Diana, once associated with the future Queen Catherine, the message was unmistakable. Inheritance was no longer about bloodline alone. It was about loyalty, control, and, perhaps, retribution. Camilla's strategy was as precise as it was personal. By selectively choosing who received which jewels, and more importantly, who didn't, she redrew the invisible map of royal influence. Princesses who had been sidelined began appearing in diamonds. Others faded. And over time, a new visual order began to emerge. One that centered not on Elizabeth's legacy, nor on Diana's sacrifice, but on Camilla's reign. To the public, it looked like royal routine. To insiders, it was a hidden coup, a quiet rewriting of the monarchy's symbolic DNA. Every sapphire, every brooch, every absent tiara told a story of shifting power. A story not recorded in any royal document, but visible in every appearance, every photograph, every missing jewel. And then came the ultimate rupture, a confrontation over a jewel that was never supposed to be worn again. It wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a provocation. When Camilla wore Diana's ruby choker to a public event attended by William and Catherine, the message was unmistakable. What followed was a confrontation never meant to reach the public. But it did. There are some jewels that belong not to the monarchy, but to memory. Diana's ruby and diamond choker was one of them. More than a piece of elegance, it was a symbol of resilience and rebellion. Worn during some of her most defiant public moments, the choker became inseparable from the image of a woman who refused to be broken by the crown. It was her armor, and after her death, it was quietly assumed, by insiders and the public alike, that such a deeply personal piece would be preserved in respect, not paraded in power. But assumptions mean little behind palace walls, and Camilla, armed with a new title and an old score, shattered them with a single appearance. The event itself seemed routine, a state gala, complete with foreign dignitaries and royal photo ops. But it was anything but ordinary. The choker appeared like a ghost, resurrected without warning, without consent. It wasn't a random choice from the vault. It was a deliberate selection, a strike. Camilla knew who would be in attendance. She knew who would be watching. And she knew exactly what that necklace still meant to William, who had once held it in his hands as a boy, as part of what remained of his mother's legacy. The reaction was instant and unfiltered. William's smile faded. Catherine, usually composed to perfection, reportedly whispered something sharp, her gaze locked on the choker. The cameras, ever so subtle, captured tension that couldn't be explained away. And when the night ended, what unfolded behind the scenes sent tremors through the palace. Multiple sources later confirmed what was long suspected. William confronted Camilla, not with rage, but with hurt. The kind of hurt that comes from betrayal, from watching a piece of his mother used as a symbol of conquest. The confrontation was brief, but fierce. Words were exchanged. Lines were crossed. And the fracture that had long been papered over between the new queen and the future king ripped open for all to feel. For Catherine, it was more than political, it was personal. Diana's legacy had been a silent guidepost in her royal journey. The choker had once been earmarked, at least informally, for her future. To see it worn not just by another woman, but by that woman in that moment, struck deeper than any public slight. Insiders say the atmosphere at Kensington Palace grew colder in the weeks that followed. Invitations rescinded, appearances minimized. The monarchy, so skilled at hiding its wounds, struggled to conceal this one. What made the incident impossible to dismiss was the sheer clarity of intent. Camilla had access to thousands of jewels, and yet she chose the one piece that connected her most bitterly to Diana. She wore it not in private, but in full view. Not in mourning, but in victory. And in doing so, she didn't just wear a necklace, she claimed a narrative. One that William and Catherine believed still belonged to them. But Camilla's influence wasn't limited to resurrecting the past. She began reassigning the future. Royal women once waited years, sometimes decades, for access to the family jewels. But under Camilla's reign, the rules changed. Suddenly, certain princesses were elevated, while others were quietly cast aside. The jewel assignments spoke louder than words. For generations, the royal jewelry collection acted as a coded language understood only by insiders. Tiaras were not rewards, they were endorsements. Brooches weren't gifts, they were subtle promotions. Who received what and when shaped the architecture of power beneath the polished surface of royal life. The late Queen Elizabeth understood the weight of each assignment. She moved carefully, methodically, always balancing lineage with discretion. And the waiting game was part of the system. Princesses learned patience. Hierarchy was respected. Appearances were orchestrated like chessboards. Then Camilla arrived and scattered the pieces. It began with Beatrice and Eugenie. Once sidelined and peripheral, the daughters of Prince Andrew suddenly found themselves back in circulation. Not with speeches, not with headlines, but with jewels. Tiaras thought to be permanently retired appeared again, now worn by the very women once considered too distant from the throne to matter. To the public, it seemed like a generous gesture. To the insiders, it was political, a message sent in diamonds. Loyalty would be rewarded. Camilla wasn't just sharing royal history. She was crafting a new future, one ally at a time. Meanwhile, Catherine, who had long been assumed to inherit the emotional weight of Diana's legacy, began to experience what many called a cooling. Her appearances in major heirlooms grew less frequent. The once expected steady stream of iconic pieces slowed to a trickle. After the ruby choker scandal, a visible shift occurred. She appeared at high-profile events without significant royal adornment, an absence that didn't go unnoticed. In the world of royalty, absence is a message in itself. The jewels weren't missing. They were simply being redirected. Camilla, ever the strategist, wasn't just choosing favorites. She was building a court. Those who stood by her, defended her, or maintained discretion found themselves unexpectedly adorned. A minor engagement would be paired with a significant brooch. A quiet family function would feature a tiara not seen in decades. It was influence wrapped in velvet, and it was effective. As Camilla's reach expanded, so did her symbolic control. The jewelry, long believed to belong to the crown itself, began to function like a private currency. Yet not everyone complied. Princess Anne, fiercely independent and unwaveringly loyal to her mother's traditional values, did not play along. Her resistance wasn't loud. It was dignified. She continued to wear her own personal jewels. She declined certain invitations. And most notably, she refused to be photographed in any piece newly assigned by Camilla. It was quiet dissent, but in royal terms, it was thunderous. The kind of silent defiance that speaks volumes behind palace doors. Royal watchers began decoding the choices obsessively. They noticed patterns, the sudden reappearance of certain necklaces, the absence of specific brooches from events where they once would have been guaranteed, the placement of a rarely seen tiara on a lesser-known royal's head just weeks after a rumored family dispute. It was a game being played not on paper, but in public, and with precision. As her influence deepened, Camilla pushed one final shocking change: rewriting who the jewels actually belonged to. Hidden in a sealed legal document was the future of Britain's most valuable jewels. For decades, the contents were assumed untouchable. But in the final months of Queen Elizabeth's life, Camilla allegedly made a move that stunned even royal insiders. For the public, the transition from one monarch to another is marked by ceremonies, processions, and scripted words. But behind the gilded curtain lies a quieter battle, one fought not with declarations, but with documents. At the heart of this struggle was the Queen's will, specifically, what insiders have referred to for years as the Jewel Clause, a section of her final testament so confidential that even senior members of the family were reportedly not privy to its full contents. Its purpose? To determine the ultimate fate of hundreds of royal heirlooms, some held in trust for the nation, others fiercely guarded as personal property. The line between the two is murky at best, and in that ambiguity, power could be seized or lost. Under tradition, certain jewels were expected to pass to the next Princess of Wales. Others were presumed to revert to the crown, remaining in limbo until allocated by the next monarch. But in the months before her passing, Queen Elizabeth reportedly held a series of quiet, urgent meetings with her legal advisors. Meetings that took place in private, without the presence of Charles, without William, and crucially, without Catherine. Who was there, however, was Camilla. And it is this detail that has since sparked one of the most unsettling rumors to swirl through the palace. The speculation is simple, yet explosive. That Camilla didn't just inherit jewels, she helped reshape their destiny. By leveraging her proximity to the Queen in her final days and using her growing influence over Charles, Camilla may have influenced revisions to the Jewel Clause, alterations that shifted the balance of inheritance in her favor. What was once assumed to go to Catherine may have been quietly redirected. What was expected to remain with the crown may have been reclassified as gifted and therefore personal. And personal property, unlike crown property, can be controlled, hidden, sold, or simply never seen again. In the days following the Queen's funeral, murmurs began. Items that had been logged by historians and royal watchers vanished from the public eye. A diamond brooch tied to Queen Victoria, an emerald parure once worn by Elizabeth herself during a state banquet in the 1970s, a sapphire bandeau that had not been seen in years, but was long assumed to be passed to the next generation. These pieces didn't appear in tributes. They didn't appear on Catherine. They simply disappeared. The palace has never commented, and they likely never will, because to open that part of the Queen's will, to expose what was taken, what was reassigned, and what was withheld, would risk tearing open a scandal far greater than any tabloid headline. It would mean acknowledging that even in death, royal favoritism shaped the legacy of 1,000 years. It would mean admitting that the jewels weren't simply symbols of continuity, but tools of manipulation. And for the monarchy, image is everything. But Camilla's silence has only deepened the unease. Her jewelry choices since the Queen's death have grown bolder, more personal, more deliberate. Pieces once thought too sacred or politically sensitive have begun to emerge, not as heirlooms, but as emblems of her rule. The message is clear. Camilla isn't borrowing history. She's owning it. And still, Camilla wasn't finished. She had one final spectacle planned, one that would force the world to see her not as a placeholder, but as the Queen. Millions watched as Camilla stepped into the coronation, wearing a crown that had been hidden for almost a century, a crown last worn by a queen who had defied her own fate. It was more than jewelry. It was Camilla's declaration of victory. Tradition dictated that the new Queen Consort should wear the crown of her predecessor. Queen Elizabeth's mother had worn Queen Mary's coronation crown. Queen Elizabeth herself had honored that lineage. And yet, Camilla broke it. She bypassed not one, but two established symbols of royal continuity. The crown of Queen Mary, a piece linked to the stoic power of early 20th century monarchy, was passed over. So too was any consideration of adapting the tiaras most recently tied to Elizabeth II. Instead, Camilla reached back further. She chose something buried by time and controversy, the crown of Queen Alexandra. That decision was no accident. Queen Alexandra had once stood where Camilla stood now, an outsider who married into the British monarchy amid scandal, skepticism, and whispered resistance. A woman scrutinized for her presence and her past, yet who ultimately carved out her own legacy through sheer endurance. To royal historians, the parallels were unavoidable. Alexandra's crown had not been seen in public for nearly 100 years. It was considered a relic, not a contender. But Camilla had it restored, not replicated, resurrected. And in doing so, she pulled a forgotten story into the heart of a global spectacle. The crown itself was not returned unchanged. Subtle, precise alterations were made to its gem settings. Emeralds, once symbols of imperial strength, were replaced with modern-cut diamonds, crisp, cold, and unmistakably contemporary. Rubies, once softened by age, were sharpened and repositioned. These weren't just aesthetic changes, they were signals. Camilla wasn't borrowing history. She was rewriting it. The jewels didn't whisper lineage, they shouted a shift. And when the world watched that moment, the procession, the placement, the pause, what they witnessed wasn't merely ceremony, it was reclamation. The message to royal watchers was deafening. This was not Elizabeth's legacy carried forward. It was Camilla's arrival, in her own image, on her own terms. The old rules had been acknowledged, and then discarded. With that one crown, Camilla tore a line through the past and declared a new order. One where allegiance, silence, and survival held more value than sentiment or tradition. There were gasps, not of shock, but of realization. The pieces had been moving all along. This was not an impulsive gesture. It was the final stroke of a campaign that had unfolded quietly for years, in vaults, in wills, in private corridors no camera had ever captured. Camilla had not just survived the storm that once threatened to keep her from the throne. She had crowned herself in its aftermath. But if Camilla's reign began with rebellion, its legacy may rest in one final question. Camilla may have won the battle. But what about the war for the monarchy's soul? With broken traditions, embittered heirs, and jewels scattered by new loyalties, the future of the crown lies not in gold, but in unresolved tension. Behind the coronation robes, beyond the polished speeches and carefully staged unity, an undercurrent of unease flows through the royal house. The wounds left by Camilla's rise, the ones wrapped not in scandal, but in sapphire, diamond, and ruby, have not healed. They've calcified. Prince William and Princess Catherine, once seen as the inevitable future of a modern monarchy, now find themselves navigating a landscape they no longer fully control. With each jewel that bypassed them, with each symbol of continuity reassigned, their role has become less of inheritance and more of interpretation. They are, in many ways, keepers of a system no longer following its own rules. And that shift hasn't gone unnoticed. Among royalists, there is fracture. One camp celebrates Camilla's transformation from controversy to crowned queen, seeing her as a symbol of resilience and evolution, proof that the monarchy can modernize, survive, and adapt in a world that demands change. The other camp sees nothing but erosion, a deliberate unspooling of centuries-old traditions where symbolic power was once protected with sacred discretion, now handed out as rewards for obedience. The quiet, solemn cadence of the monarchy replaced with a bolder, sharper rhythm. One many argue lacks the mystery and moral weight that once defined the crown. The jewels themselves, once unified by a common legacy, now serve different masters. Some remain in their rightful places. Others are on loan, reshuffled to unfamiliar figures. Many have simply vanished from public record. And while the Crown Estate claims neutrality, the growing sense among palace insiders is that these jewels are no longer passive heirlooms. They are chess pieces, because the true cost of breaking tradition is not always immediate. It's generational. The monarchy has survived wars, abdications, and divorces, but it has never faced a moment where its very symbols, its visual language of power, have been so openly contested, so redefined. And in doing so, Camilla may have ensured her place in history. But at what cost? Because once the royal jewelry rules are broken, can they ever truly be restored?